The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden block with the finality of a hangman's noose, shattering Abigail Drake's heart into 1,000 pieces as she watched the crowd descend upon the remnants of her life like vultures to carrion. Standing beneath the unforgiving Arizona sun in the dusty town square of Eagar, Arizona Territory, 1882, she clutched her father's pocket watch, the only possession she'd managed to keep, and tried to maintain her dignity as strangers pawed through her belongings. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, a fine oak dresser with brass fittings, belonged to the late Dr. Drake himself. Starting bid at $2, bellowed the auctioneer, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Abigail winced at the mention of her father. Dr. Thomas Drake had been Eagar's only physician for 15 years until typhoid fever claimed him just 3 months ago. Now, at 22, she found herself orphaned and drowning in her father's debts she hadn't known existed until the bank came calling. $2 for this fine piece of craftsmanship? Why, the brass alone is worth that much. The auctioneer's voice rose with practiced indignation. A hesitant hand went up. $2. $2 from Mrs. Henderson. Do I hear $2.50? Another hand. $2.50? $3, called a deep voice from the back of the crowd. The bidding continued, but Abigail barely registered it. She'd spent the past week saying goodbye to each item, her mother's china, her father's medical books, the furniture that had witnessed her entire life unfold. Now it was all being scattered to the winds, piece by piece, memory by memory. Sold for $4.25. The gavel fell again. Abigail closed her eyes, trying to stem her tears. Ladies didn't cry in public. Her mother had taught her that much before consumption took her when Abigail was 16. But oh, how she wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. Miss Drake. She opened her eyes to find Sheriff Wilson standing before her, his weathered face creased with sympathy. At 62, he'd been a friend to her father and had delayed this auction as long as legally possible. "I'm sorry it's come to this," he said quietly. "If there was any other way." "I understand, Sheriff," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "The debts must be paid." He nodded, uncomfortable. "The bank says even with everything sold, it might not cover it all. They're talking about the house, too." The house. Her breath caught. The modest 2-story home at the edge of town was the last thing she had. Where would she go? "I see," she managed. "When?" 2 weeks, unless the auction brings in more than expected. He patted her arm awkwardly. "I'll do what I can to help you find a place." As he walked away, Abigail felt a curious numbness spreading through her. The auctioneer continued his theatrical performance, her possessions the unwilling actors in this tragedy, her mother's silver hairbrush, her father's rocking chair, the quilt her grandmother had made for her 16th birthday. Each item that disappeared into the crowd took another piece of her history, her identity. "Look at this magnificent roll-top desk, folks. Genuine oak with 7 drawers and cubby holes galore. Where else will you find such craftsmanship? Starting at $5. Her father's desk, the centerpiece of his study where he'd written his medical notes, paid his bills, and told Abigail bedtime stories when she was small. The sight of it on display like this was almost more than she could bear. $5, came a voice from the edge of the crowd. $5 from Mr. Peterson. Do I hear 6? $6, called someone else. 7, countered the first bidder. Abigail stared at her boots, unable to watch. The bidding escalated quickly. $7.50, $8, $9 unusual for Eagar, where most folks counted their pennies carefully. $10, came a new voice, deep and clear, with a slight southern drawl. The crowd parted slightly, and Abigail caught sight of the speaker. A tall man with broad shoulders stood at the back, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't from Eagar. She would have remembered him. $10 going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. The stranger nodded, but didn't move forward to claim his purchase. Instead, he remained where he was, arms crossed over his chest. The auction continued. Her mother's silver tea service, her collection of books, the cherry wood dining table where she'd taken every meal for 22 years, and each time a valuable item came up, The mysterious stranger's voice rang out with the winning bid. Sometimes he jumped straight to a price no one in Eagar could match. Other times he patiently outlasted the local bidders. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Who was he? Why was he buying so much? Abigail found herself wondering the same thing. Perhaps he was a dealer, planning to resell her family treasures for profit in Phoenix or Tucson. The auctioneer's enthusiasm grew with each high bid. Next, ladies and gentlemen, this exquisite spinet piano, brought all the way from Boston. Just look at that inlay work, starting at $20. The piano. Abigail's throat tightened. Her mother had taught her to play on that instrument, their fingers dancing over the keys together. After her mother died, playing those familiar melodies had been Abigail's only comfort. 25, said the stranger immediately, his voice brooking no argument. No competing bids came. Even in its heyday, Eagar had never been wealthy enough for many families to afford such luxuries. Sold for $25 to our generous bidder. By midday, the stranger had purchased nearly every item of value in the auction. The crowd had thinned, many disappointed at being outbid or simply tired of standing in the heat. Abigail remained, a sentinel at her own execution. The auction had raised far more money than expected, enough to cover her father's debts with the local bank, but her relief was tempered by the knowledge that everything she'd ever loved now belonged to a man whose face she couldn't even clearly see. As the auctioneer sold the last few items, kitchen implements and tools, that the stranger showed no interest in, Abigail noticed Sheriff Wilson speaking with him. The sheriff nodded several times, looking surprised, then glanced in her direction. Finally, the auctioneer struck his gavel a final time. That concludes our auction, folks. Buyers, please pay the clerk and arrange to collect your items. People swarmed toward the payment table, but the stranger walked in the opposite direction toward Abigail. As he approached, she got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his cheeks. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work and open spaces. "Miss Drake," he said, removing his hat. His hair was dark brown, cut short, but still managing to curl slightly where it was longest. "Yes," she replied, unsure whether to be afraid or angry at this man, who now owned her life in pieces. "Preston Harrington," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "I'd like to speak with you privately, if I may." Abigail hesitated. Proper young ladies didn't speak privately with unknown men, but proper young ladies didn't usually find themselves destitute and homeless, either. "About what, Mr. Harrington?" "About your belongings." He gestured toward the collection of furniture, trunks, and household goods now bearing his claim tickets. "And your home." Her spine stiffened. "My home is not for sale today." "No, but it will be soon, according to the sheriff." His eyes were kind, which somehow made this worse. She didn't want his pity. "What business is that of yours, sir?" Instead of answering directly, he said, "I have a wagon. Perhaps we could speak at your house, away from prying ears." Abigail glanced around. Several townsfolk were indeed watching their interaction with undisguised curiosity. The gossip in Eagar would be relentless regardless, but she preferred not to provide more fodder. "Very well," she conceded, "though I don't see what there is to discuss." Harrington's wagon was already loaded with some of her smaller possessions. He helped her up onto the seat with a strong, calloused hand, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The team of horses responded immediately to his touch, pulling away from the town square toward the edge of Eagar where her home stood. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of hooves on the hard-packed dirt road. Abigail stole glances at her companion, trying to understand what a man like him wanted with her family's things. His clothes were of good quality, but practical: a cotton shirt, leather vest, durable trousers, and boots that had seen many miles. No fancy Eastern dandy, but not a common cowhand either. "You're wondering why I bought everything," he said suddenly, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "Among other things," she admitted, "I knew your father." This caught her by surprise. "You did? How?" "I don't recall seeing you in Eagar before." "I wasn't in Eagar. It was during the war. I was barely more than a boy. fighting for the Confederacy because that's what Virginia boys did. Got shot up pretty badly at Gettysburg. His voice remained even, conversational. Union Field Hospital. Your father was the doctor who saved my leg when others wanted to take it off. Said I was young and strong and deserved a chance to heal properly. Abigail stared at him, processing this revelation. Her father had rarely spoken about his war experiences. He wrote his name and hometown in my Bible, Harrington continued. Said if I ever needed a doctor again, I should look him up. I never forgot that kindness. The wagon turned onto the lane leading to her house, a modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch. White paint peeled from the clapboards, and the garden her mother had once tended so carefully was now overgrown. It had been hard to maintain appearances while caring for her dying father. So, you came looking for him, she said, as he pulled the team to a stop. I did. Arrived in town yesterday only to learn he'd passed on. He set the brake and turned to face her fully. And that his daughter was about to lose everything. Harrington jumped down from the wagon and came around to help her descend. As her boots touched the ground, she looked up at him, still confused. That doesn't explain why you bought my belongings, Mr. Harrington. He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his serious face. Preston, please, and I think it's better if I show you, rather than tell you. She led him up the porch steps and unlocked the front door. The house felt eerily empty, most of the furniture having been removed for the auction. Her footsteps echoed in the barren parlor. This won't take long, Harrington said, pulling a folded document from his vest pocket. I need you to sign this. What is it? She asked, taking the paper cautiously. Bill of sale. For everything I purchased today. She unfolded it, skimming the legal language. I don't understand. You already own these things. Not anymore. He produced a pencil from the same pocket. Once you sign that, it all belongs to you again. Abigail stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? I'm giving it back to you, Miss Drake. All of it. The furniture, the piano, your mother's silver, your father's books, everything. Her legs suddenly felt weak. She groped for support and found only Harrington's arm, steady and strong beneath her fingers. Why would you do such a thing? She whispered. He guided her to sit on a trunk that hadn't yet been taken for the auction. Your father gave me back my future when he saved my leg. Seems only right I should try to give you back yours. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears she'd been holding back all day. But the cost, it must have been over $100. I can't accept. You can and you will, he said firmly. I've done well for myself these past years. I own a cattle ranch near Prescott. This money means little to me, but these things mean everything to you. The tears spilled over now, tracking down her cheeks. I don't know what to say. Say you'll sign the paper, he replied with a gentle smile. And then, perhaps you'll let me help you bring your belongings home where they belong. But the debt, the bank will just take the house in 2 weeks anyway. No, they won't. He produced another document. I settled your father's debt in full. The bank manager was quite amenable once I showed him the color of my money. The house is yours, free and clear. Abigail couldn't speak. The kindness of this stranger, this man who felt indebted to her father for an act of medical ethics performed 20 years ago, was overwhelming. She had gone from destitute to secure in the span of an afternoon. Mr. Harrington Preston. I can never repay such generosity, she finally managed. I don't want repayment, he replied. Just sign the papers and consider the matter settled. With shaking hands, she signed both documents. When she finished, he folded them carefully and returned them to his pocket. Now, he said, rising to his feet, shall we begin bringing your life back home? For the remainder of the afternoon, they worked together. Preston's wagon made multiple trips between the auction site and her home. The townspeople watched in bewilderment as the items they had bid on, or wished to bid on, returned to the Drake house. Sheriff Wilson helped with the heavier pieces, his face splitting into a rare grin when Preston explained what he'd done. Your father would be proud, Miss Abigail, the sheriff said, as they maneuvered the roll-top desk back into the study. He helped a good man, and that good deeds come full circle. By sunset, most of her possessions had been returned to their rightful places. Her mother's china gleamed in the cabinet, her father's medical books lined the study shelves, and the cherry dining table once again anchored the dining room. The spinet piano stood in the parlor corner, waiting for fingers to bring it to life again. Exhausted but elated, Abigail insisted Preston stay for supper. It was the least she could do. She prepared a simple meal from her meager pantry beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved peaches, and they ate by lamplight at the reclaimed dining table. "Tell me about yourself," she said as they ate. "You know my story, but I know little of yours beyond Gettysburg." Preston twirled his fork thoughtfully. "Not much to tell. After the war, I headed west like many men. Worked as a cowhand for several years, saved my money, bought some land when cattle prices were good. Now, I run about 500 head with 6 hired hands. It's a good life." "No family?" she asked, then blushed at her forwardness. He shook his head. "My parents died before the war. No siblings, no wife." He smiled slightly. "Hard to court a lady when you live 20 miles from your nearest neighbor. It must be lonely." "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the work keeps me busy. And I have my books for company." "You read?" The question came out more surprised than she intended. He laughed, a rich sound that filled the room. "Don't let the calluses fool you, Miss Drake. I was studying to be a teacher before the war changed everything. I still have a fondness for Dickens and Shakespeare." Her estimation of him rose even higher. "Please, call me Abigail. After what you've done, formality seems unnecessary." "Abigail," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name on his tongue. As they finished their meal, a comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, the sky deepened to purple, and the first stars appeared. Abigail realized with a start that she had not felt this peaceful, this secure, since before her father's illness. "What will you do now?" Preston asked as he helped her clear the dishes. "Continue teaching at the school, I suppose." She had been the town school teacher for the past 2 years, the position a favor from the town council to Dr. Drake's daughter, despite her lack of formal training. "It doesn't pay much, but now that the debts are settled and the house is secure, it should be enough." "Good." He dried his hands on a towel. "Well, I should be going. I've taken a room at the boarding house for tonight, but I aim to start back to Prescott tomorrow." Disappointment flared unexpectedly in her chest. Of course he would leave. He had a ranch to run, a life far from Eagar. Yet, in the space of one day, he had become important to her in a way she couldn't articulate. "Must you go so soon?" The words escaped before she could consider their impropriety. His blue eyes held hers for a long moment. "My foreman can handle things for a few days, I suppose. I did ride hard to get here. My horse could use the rest." "Then stay," she said simply. "Let me show you Eagar. Let me thank you properly for your kindness." A slow smile spread across his face. "I'd like that, Abigail." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Abigail woke early, a lifetime habit, and was surprised to find herself humming as she prepared breakfast. The events of yesterday still seemed dreamlike. She kept touching things: the banister, the kitchen table, her mother's china plates, to reassure herself they were really still hers. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Preston stood on her porch, hat in hand, freshly shaven, and wearing a clean shirt. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," she replied, suddenly conscious of her simple cotton dress and hastily pinned hair. "I was just making breakfast. Would you care to join me?" "That's kind of you, but I've already eaten at the boarding house." He hesitated. "I thought perhaps I might escort you to church, if you're attending the service today." Church. In the tumult of yesterday, she'd almost forgotten it was Sunday. "Yes, I'd like that very much." "I'll wait while you get ready," he offered. Abigail hurried upstairs to change into her Sunday dress, a blue calico that brought out her eyes, according to her father, and arranged her honey blonde hair more carefully. When she descended, Preston's admiring glance sent a flush of warmth through her. They walked to the small white church at the center of town, where every head turned as they entered together. Abigail felt the stares and whispers, but held her head high. Let them talk. Preston's actions had been those of a Christian gentleman, nothing more. The Reverend Adams preached about the Good Samaritan, and Abigail couldn't help glancing at Preston. He met her eyes briefly, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. When the collection plate came around, he placed a generous amount in it, then added more when he thought no one was looking. After the service, they were surrounded by curious townsfolk. Preston answered their questions politely but firmly, downplaying his generosity and redirecting attention whenever possible. Several of the town's young women eyed him with undisguised interest, but his attention remained fixed on Abigail. "Walk with me?" he asked when they finally extricated themselves from the crowd. They strolled through Eagar, Abigail pointing out landmarks: the schoolhouse where she taught, the general store, her father's former medical office now occupied by a younger doctor from Tucson. Preston listened attentively, asking questions about the town's history and her life there. "It's smaller than Prescott," he observed, "but it has a certain charm." "It's home," she replied simply. "The only one I've ever known." They stopped at the edge of town, where the road continued west toward Prescott and beyond. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Thank you for yesterday," Abigail said finally. "Not just for what you did, but for how you did it. You preserved my dignity along with my possessions." "Your father preserved more than my dignity when he saved my leg," Preston replied quietly. "He gave me a future. A man doesn't forget a debt like that." "Is that all it was? Repaying a debt?" His eyes met hers, searching. "It started that way," he admitted. "But now," she prompted when he didn't continue. "Now I find myself reluctant to leave Eagar," he said, his voice dropping. "Or rather, to leave someone in Eagar." Abigail's heart quickened. "Mr. Harrington." "Preston," he corrected gently. "Preston," she amended. "We've only just met." "I know." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not declaring intentions, Abigail. That would be presumptuous. I'm merely suggesting that I might find reasons to visit Eagar again, if I were welcome." "You would be most welcome," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I shall have to find business in this direction soon." The next few days passed in a pleasant blur. Preston extended his stay, finding excuses to remain in Eagar. He helped Abigail repair her sagging front porch, the work bringing them into easy conversation about their lives and dreams. He spoke of his ranch, the Rolling H, he called it with obvious pride, describing the house he'd built, the horses he bred, and the cattle that provided his livelihood. In turn, she told him about her teaching, her struggles to keep her father's household running during his illness, and her uncertainty about the future. He listened without judgment, offering occasional insights that revealed his intelligence and compassion. On Wednesday afternoon, they sat on the newly repaired porch, drinking lemonade as the summer day cooled toward evening. Abigail had just finished telling a story about one of her more mischievous students when Preston set down his glass with a sigh. "I have to leave tomorrow," he said. "My foreman sent word that one of the stock ponds is running dry, and we need to move the herd before we lose animals." Though she'd known this moment would come, disappointment still washed through her. "Of course, your ranch needs you." "Abigail?" He took her hand, his touch sending warmth up her arm. "I'd like to write to you, if that's acceptable." "I'd like that too," she replied, meeting his gaze. "And perhaps, when things are settled with the herd, I might return to Eagar." "I hope you will." Her voice was barely above a whisper. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Good. That's good." They sat in silence as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Something was building between them, something neither was ready to name, but both recognized. It felt both fragile and inevitable, like the first green shoots after a long winter. The next morning, Abigail walked with Preston to the livery stable where his horse waited, saddled and ready. The black gelding stomped impatiently, eager to be on the trail. "He knows we have a long ride ahead," Preston said, patting the animal's neck. "Be safe," she said, suddenly anxious about the dangers of the trail bandits, accidents, the harsh landscape itself. "I always am." He hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you." She unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound volume of poetry, Tennyson's collected works. "It's not new," he said apologetically. "I've had it for years, but when you mentioned he was your favorite poet—" "It's perfect," she interrupted, running her fingers over the worn cover. "Thank you." He smiled, relieved. "There's a particular poem marked, Page 73. She made a mental note to look as soon as she returned home. I'll treasure it. An awkward moment stretched between them, both aware of the watching eyes of passers-by. The strictures of propriety prevented any demonstrative farewell in public. Until we meet again, Abigail Drake, Preston said formally, tipping his hat. Godspeed. Preston Harrington, she replied with equal formality, though her heart raced with unspoken words. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, settled his hat more firmly, and with a final nod, turned the animal west. Abigail watched until he disappeared around a bend in the road, then clutched the book to her chest and walked slowly home. Inside, she immediately turned to page 73 to find, in memoriam, with a particular stanza underlined, I hold it true, whate'er befall, I feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Tears sprang to her eyes, not of sadness, but of a complicated joy. In 5 short days, Preston Harrington had rewritten the story of her life. He had entered it as a stranger and departed as, what? Not quite a suitor, not merely a friend. Something in between. Something with potential. Over the next weeks, Abigail settled back into her routine. She taught at the schoolhouse 6 days a week, tended her garden in the evenings, and played her restored piano on Sundays after church. The townsfolk gradually stopped whispering about that cowboy and her miraculous reversal of fortune, finding newer gossip to occupy them. Preston's first letter arrived 3 weeks after his departure, the envelope dusty and creased from its journey. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, uncertain what to expect. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant, the letters flowing across the page with confident strokes. He wrote of his ranch, the dry pond now replenished by unexpected rain, the new calves strengthening daily, the wildflowers carpeting the hills after the summer storms. He described a sunset that reminded him of her blue dress, a book he was reading that he thought she might enjoy, and his hope that Eagar was treating her kindly in his absence. The letter contained no declarations, no promises, yet something in the careful choice of words and the warmth of his descriptions gave Abigail hope. She read it 3 times before composing her reply, striving for the same balance of warmth and restraint. So began their correspondence letters, traveling back and forth across the Arizona territory, bridging the physical distance between Eagar and Prescott. Abigail found herself watching for the mail rider with an eagerness that amused the postmaster, Mr. Collins. Another letter from your cowboy, Miss Drake, he would say with a knowing smile, handing over the now familiar envelope. He's not my cowboy, Mr. Collins, she would reply primly, but she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach at the sight of Preston's handwriting. As summer gave way to fall, their letters grew longer, more personal. Preston wrote of his childhood in Virginia. His brief time at college before the war changed everything, and his dreams for the future of his ranch. Abigail shared stories of her students, her memories of her parents, and her own modest hopes for a life beyond teaching. In late September, 2 months after his departure, Preston's letter contained news that made her heart leap. Business requires me to travel to Holbrook next week. As Eagar lies not far from my path, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for a night or 2. I find myself eager to see how your garden fares and whether your troublesome student has improved his spelling. Abigail's reply was immediate and affirmative. She spent the next week in a flurry of activity cleaning the already tidy house, baking his favorite apple pie, a preference mentioned in one of his letters, and trying to calm her jangling nerves. What if their connection existed only on paper? What if the man who arrived was somehow different from the one she'd come to know through his words? Her fears proved groundless. When Preston rode up to her house on a crisp October afternoon, his face lighting up at the sight of her on the porch, Abigail knew that their correspondence had only deepened what had begun during those 5 days in July. "Welcome back to Eagar," she said, suddenly shy despite months of intimate letters. "It's good to be back," he replied, his voice warm with sincerity. That evening, they talked until the fire burned low, moving from books to politics to personal philosophies with the ease of old friends. When he finally took his leave, propriety dictated he stay at the boarding house rather than her home. Despite the guest room she had prepared, Abigail felt both exhausted and exhilarated. "May I call on you tomorrow before I continue to Holbrook?" he asked as he stood on her porch. "I would be disappointed if you didn't," she admitted. His smile was tender in the lamplight. "Sleep well, Abigail." She watched him walk down the path, his tall figure silhouetted against the star-strewn sky. Something had shifted between them, moving beyond friendship into a territory both thrilling and terrifying. She wasn't sure when it had happened, perhaps in the exchange of letters, perhaps in the moment she saw him ride into town today, but she knew with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with Preston Harrington. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like coming home. Preston's business in Holbrook proved suspiciously brief. He returned to Eagar 3 days later, explaining that the cattle buyer he'd arranged to meet had been delayed. Since he was in no particular hurry to return to the ranch, he said, he might as well wait in Eagar where the company was far more pleasant. The townsfolk noticed. How could they not? When Preston escorted Abigail to church that Sunday, the knowing glances and whispered comments followed them down the aisle. After the service, Mrs. Henderson, the town's self-appointed social guardian, cornered Abigail by the hymnal cabinet. "Your cowboy seems quite taken with our little town," she said, her tone suggesting she didn't believe his interest was in Eagar itself. "Mr. Harrington has business in the area," Abigail replied evenly. "Indeed?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Well, I suppose a young woman in your position can't be too particular, though a rancher from Prescott is certainly better than no prospects at all." The barb stung, but Abigail maintained her composure. "How fortunate that we all have the freedom to choose our own associations, Mrs. Henderson. I hope you have a pleasant afternoon." She walked away with her head high, but the woman's words echoed uncomfortably. Was that how the town saw Preston's attention as charity extended to a spinster schoolteacher? The thought soured her mood. Preston noticed her distraction as they walked home. "Something troubling you?" She hesitated, not wanting to repeat Mrs. Henderson's insinuations. "It's nothing, just small-town talk." He stopped, turning to face her. "Abigail, if my presence is causing difficulty for you—" "No!" The word came out more forcefully than she intended. More softly, she added, "No, that's not it at all. It's just, people wonder why someone like you would be interested in someone like me." "Someone like you?" His brow furrowed. "You mean an intelligent, beautiful woman with courage and grace. Why wouldn't I be interested?" The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. "Preston." "Let them wonder," he said firmly, offering his arm again. "What matters is what we know." As they continued walking, Abigail realized he hadn't actually specified what "we know," but the warmth in his eyes suggested it might be the same realization that had come to her the night before. Preston extended his stay for another week, finding daily excuses to call on Abigail. They rode together through the countryside, picnicked by Eagle Creek, and spent evenings on her porch discussing everything and nothing. He attended her school one afternoon, charming her students with stories of ranch life and demonstrating rope tricks that had the children cheering. On his final evening in Eagar, Preston invited Abigail to dinner at the town's only restaurant, a bold public statement, in a community where such invitations usually signaled serious intentions. She wore her best dress, a green muslin that had been her mother's, altered to fit her smaller frame. The restaurant owner, Mr. Jimenez, gave them the best table by the window and served his special chili con carne with freshly baked cornbread. They talked easily, their conversation flowing as it always did, but Abigail sensed an undercurrent of tension. Preston seemed preoccupied, his gaze often drifting to the window or the doorway, as if expecting someone. "Is everything all right?" she finally asked. "You seem distracted." He started slightly, then smiled apologetically. "Forgive me, I have a lot on my mind tonight." Before she could inquire further, the restaurant door opened and Sheriff Wilson entered, nodding to Preston before taking a seat at the counter. "Excuse me for a moment," Preston said, rising from his chair. Abigail watched, puzzled, as he crossed to speak with the sheriff. The two men conversed briefly, the sheriff handing Preston something small that disappeared immediately into his pocket. When Preston returned to their table, his expression was both nervous and resolved. "What was that about?" she asked. Sheriff Wilson was holding something for me, he replied cryptically. Abigail, there's something I need to ask you. Her heart began to race. Yes? Not here? He glanced around at the other diners, several of whom were watching them with undisguised interest. Would you walk with me after dinner? The night is pleasant, and I've always found the stars particularly bright in Eagar. Of course, she managed, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. They finished their meal in a state of heightened awareness, every glance, every brush of fingers as they reached for the salt, seeming fraught with significance. When they finally stepped outside into the cool October night, Abigail felt as if she might float away on the evening breeze. Preston offered his arm, and they walked slowly through the quiet streets of Eagar. Most homes were already dark, their occupants retired for the night. Only an occasional lamp gleamed in a window, or the distant bark of a dog disturbed the silence. He led her to the small town park, where a wooden bench sat beneath an ancient cottonwood tree. The moon, nearly full, spilled silver light across the landscape, illuminating Preston's features as he turned to face her. Abigail, he began, his voice lower than usual. These past months have been the most meaningful of my life. For me as well, she admitted softly. When I came to Eagar, I thought I was repaying a debt. I never expected... He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I never expected to find someone who would change how I see the world, how I see my future. Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Preston, please, let me finish before my courage fails. He took her hands in his. I know this may seem sudden to others, though to me it feels as if I've known you my whole life. The truth is, I can no longer imagine a future that doesn't include you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, what the sheriff had given him at the restaurant, she realized. Sinking to one knee before her, Preston opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Abigail Drake, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? For a moment she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. This man who had saved her possessions, who had restored her dignity and security, was now offering her his heart, his name, his future. Yes, she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, I will marry you, Preston Harrington. His face transformed with joy. Rising, he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, then drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise of tenderness to come, but it sent warmth spreading through Abigail's entire body. When they finally parted, both were breathless. The ring was my mother's, Preston explained, his voice husky. I sent word to my foreman to retrieve it from my safe and give it to Sheriff Wilson when he came through Prescott last week. It's beautiful, she said, admiring how the moonlight played across the pearl. Not as beautiful as you. He traced her cheek with his fingertips. I thought perhaps a spring wedding. It would give us time to prepare, and the wildflowers on the ranch would be in bloom. Spring sounds perfect, she agreed, then hesitated. But Preston, what about my house, my position at the school? Whatever you wish, he said immediately. The ranch is my home, but I would never ask you to abandon yours if it means too much to you. We could divide our time, or if you prefer to stay in Eagar, I could look into purchasing land nearby. His willingness to consider her needs, to build their future together, rather than simply expecting her to conform to his life, confirmed what Abigail already knew. Preston Harrington was an extraordinary man. I think I would like to see your ranch, she said, to make a home with you there. But perhaps we could keep my house too, for visits to Eagar? Absolutely. He smiled, drawing her close again. Anything that makes you happy makes me happy. They walked back to her home, hand in hand, making plans for their future together. When they reached her porch, Preston kissed her again, more deeply this time, before reluctantly taking his leave. I'll speak with Reverend Adams tomorrow, he promised, and then I really must return to the ranch, but I'll be back before you know it. I'll hold you to that, she replied, her fingers touching the ring that now adorned her hand. As she watched him walk away, Abigail marveled at how completely her life had transformed since that terrible day in July, when she thought she was losing everything. Instead, She had gained something far more precious than possessions. She had found love, with a man whose generosity was matched only by his integrity. The news of their engagement spread through Eagar like wildfire the next day. Most townsfolk responded with genuine congratulations, though a few, like Mrs. Henderson, couldn't resist implying that Abigail had somehow trapped the wealthy rancher. Abigail let such comments slide off her like water from a duck's back. She knew the truth of their relationship, and Preston's obvious devotion made such insinuations seem merely petty. Reverend Adams agreed to perform the ceremony in April, giving them 6 months to prepare. Preston departed for his ranch the following day, promising to return within a month to begin making arrangements for their future together. "It feels strange to be planning a wedding without my parents," Abigail confessed as they said their goodbyes. Preston's expression softened with understanding. "They'll be with us in spirit, and you'll have a new family soon, not to replace them, but to add to your circle of love." "You have a way with words, Mr. Harrington," she said, smiling through the tears that threatened. "Only when I'm inspired, future Mrs. Harrington," he replied, kissing her hand before mounting his horse. "1 month, I promise." The weeks after Preston's departure passed both quickly and agonizingly slowly for Abigail. She threw herself into her teaching, started packing non-essential items for the eventual move to the ranch, and began working on her wedding dress using her mother's lace-trimmed silk that had been preserved in lavender for decades. Letters flew between Eagar and Prescott, filled with both practical details about their future and tender expressions of affection. Preston wrote of the improvements he was making to the ranch house, adding a larger kitchen because he knew she enjoyed cooking, building bookshelves for their combined libraries, planting a garden for her arrival. Abigail responded with her own preparations and questions about ranch life, determined to be a true partner in their shared future. True to his word, Preston returned to Eagar 1 month later, staying for a week to introduce Abigail to his banker, make arrangements for the care of her house during their absences, and generally ensure that their wedding plans were progressing smoothly. Their time together confirmed what they already knew. They were well matched in temperament, values, and vision for the future. The winter months brought heavy snow to the high country, making travel between Prescott and Eagar difficult. Preston managed one brief visit in January, bringing Christmas gifts and taking the opportunity to meet with Reverend Adams again about the ceremony details. During this visit, they finalized their wedding plans, choosing music, scripture readings, and deciding on a small reception at Abigail's home after the service. By March, with the wedding only weeks away, Eagar was abuzz with excitement. The town hadn't seen such a celebration in years, and everyone wanted to contribute. Women offered to bake cakes and pies, men volunteered to set up tables and chairs in Abigail's yard, and children practiced songs to sing at the reception. Preston arrived 2 weeks before the wedding date, bringing a wagon loaded with gifts from his ranch hands and neighbors in Prescott. Among them was a hand-carved hope chest from his foreman, a quilt from the foreman's wife, and various household items to start their married life together. "I'm overwhelmed," Abigail said as they unpacked the wagon. "I never expected such generosity from people I haven't even met." "They're eager to meet you," Preston replied. "You've become something of a legend on the ranch, the schoolteacher who captured the boss's heart." She blushed. "And what do they think of this legend?" "They're mostly relieved I finally found someone who can put up with my stubborn ways," he said with a laugh. "Particularly Manuel, my cook. He's threatened to quit at least 3 times if I don't stop critiquing his biscuits." "Perhaps I should learn his biscuit recipe first thing," she teased. "He'd love that. He's already planning a feast for when we return." Preston's expression grew serious. "Abigail, there's something I've been meaning to ask. Would you object to a brief wedding trip before we go to the ranch? There's a place I'd like to show you, a valley about 2 days' ride from Prescott, with hot springs and the most beautiful wildflowers you've ever seen." "That sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. "I've never traveled much beyond Eagar." "Then it's settled. We'll spend a week there before heading home to the ranch." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Home. It feels right to say that with you." The final days before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of activity. Abigail finished her dress with help from Mrs. Wilson, the sheriff's wife. Preston's best man, his foreman James, arrived from Prescott with the wedding rings they had ordered from a silversmith in Tucson. The church was decorated with early spring wildflowers and ribbons, and Abigail's house was thoroughly cleaned and prepared for the reception. The evening before the wedding, Preston hosted a dinner for the wedding party at the restaurant. James told embarrassing stories about Preston's early days as a rancher, while Abigail's friend Lucy, who would serve as her maid of honor, countered with tales from their school days. Laughter flowed as freely as the wine, and Abigail found herself marveling at how complete her happiness felt. As the dinner concluded, Preston rose to offer a toast. To friends old and new who have supported us on our journey to tomorrow, and to Abigail, who gave meaning to my life when I thought I was simply repaying an old debt, I am the most fortunate of men. The group raised their glasses, and Abigail blinked back tears of joy. Whatever challenges the future might hold, she knew they would face them together. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of warmth as the sun rose higher. Abigail woke early, too excited to sleep. Lucy arrived at 8 o'clock to help her prepare, bringing fresh flowers for her hair and the news that the entire town seemed to be congregating around the church already, though the ceremony wasn't until noon. Everyone wants to see the couple who had the most romantic courtship in Eagar's history, Lucy explained as she helped Abigail into her dress. Half the young women in town are swooning over the story, the mysterious cowboy who bought everything at the auction, only to give it all back, then return to claim the lady's heart. It wasn't quite that dramatic, Abigail protested, though she had to admit the tale did sound like something from a novel when condensed that way. It was exactly that dramatic, Lucy insisted, arranging the lace veil. And now, look at you about to become Mrs. Preston Harrington, mistress of a cattle ranch. It's like a fairy tale. Abigail studied her reflection in the mirror. The ivory silk dress, with its high collar, fitted bodice, and flowing skirt, transformed her from schoolteacher to bride. Her mother's lace, carefully incorporated into the veil and cuffs, connected her past to her present. The pearl ring on her finger, soon to be joined by a gold band, symbolized her future. "I never thought I'd be this happy," she admitted softly. Lucy squeezed her hand. "You deserve every bit of it, Abigail. After everything you went through with your father's illness, the debts, nearly losing your home, this is your reward for your faith and perseverance." At precisely noon, Sheriff Wilson arrived in his buggy to escort Abigail to the church. In the absence of her father, he had volunteered to give her away, an offer that had touched her deeply. "You look beautiful, Miss Drake," he said gruffly as he helped her into the buggy. "Your parents would be proud." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, her throat tight with emotion. "For everything." The church was indeed packed, with townspeople filling every pew and standing along the walls. As Sheriff Wilson led her down the aisle to the strains of "Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring" played on the church's small organ, Abigail's eyes fixed on Preston waiting at the altar. His expression of wonder and love as he watched her approach made her heart swell with happiness. Reverend Adams conducted the ceremony with dignity and warmth, speaking of the covenant of marriage and the journey the couple was beginning together. When the time came to exchange vows, Preston's voice rang clear and strong through the church. "I, Preston, take you, Abigail, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Abigail's response was equally firm, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "I, Abigail, take you, Preston, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the church windows. Then, with the words, "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Adams united them officially. Preston's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and the church erupted in applause as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife for the first time. The reception at Abigail's house, now their house together, stretched into the evening. Tables laden with food covered the yard, musicians played fiddle and guitar on the porch, and lanterns were lit as darkness fell. Preston and Abigail moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like every resident of Eagar. As the celebration began to wind down, Preston found Abigail talking with her former students, who had presented her with a hand-drawn book of pictures depicting their favorite school memories. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, the new name bringing a smile to both their faces. "Might I steal you away for a moment?" He led her to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the lingering guests. "Happy?" "Completely," she assured him, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I admit I'm looking forward to leaving tomorrow, as wonderful as this has been. You're ready for it to be just the two of us," he finished for her. "Exactly." He kissed her temple. "The wagon is packed. We'll leave at first light, before anyone can delay us with more well wishes and advice." Abigail laughed. "Mrs. Henderson has already cornered me twice with rather detailed suggestions for how to be a proper wife." "And did you tell her you plan to be a most improper one?" Preston teased, his eyes twinkling in the lantern light. "Preston!" she exclaimed in mock scandal, then lowered her voice. "That would hardly be appropriate conversation for a wedding reception." "Then perhaps we should save it for later," he murmured, his lips brushing her ear. A pleasant shiver ran through her. "Perhaps we should." They rejoined their guests for the final festivities, cutting the three-tiered wedding cake Mrs. Jimenez had baked, accepting a toast from Sheriff Wilson, and finally waving goodbye as the last well-wishers departed. As promised, they left Eagar the next morning, with the dawn, beginning their journey as husband and wife. The wedding trip was everything Preston had promised. The valley with its hot springs provided a private paradise where they could truly begin their life together, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, sharing stories they hadn't yet told, and cementing the bond that had formed so unexpectedly less than a year before. When they finally arrived at the Rolling H Ranch after their week away, Abigail was immediately struck by its beauty. Nestled in a broad valley with mountains rising in the distance, the ranch house was larger than she had imagined, a two-story structure of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Corrals, barns, and bunkhouses were arranged in neat formation nearby, while cattle grazed on the lush spring grass of the surrounding pastures. The ranch hands had gathered to welcome them, forming a line of grinning, hat-holding men, eager to meet the woman who had captured their boss's heart. Abigail greeted each one warmly, committing names and faces to memory. Determined to be as good a mistress to the ranch as she had been a teacher to her students, Manuel, the cook Preston had mentioned, presented them with a feast that evening, and Abigail made good on her promise to learn his biscuit recipe the very next day. The house itself was exactly as Preston had described in his letters: the new bookshelves, the enlarged kitchen, the garden plot prepared for her arrival. But he had saved one surprise. "I have something to show you," he said on their third evening after dinner. Leading her upstairs to a room she hadn't yet explored, he opened the door to reveal a small study equipped with a desk, chair, and several empty bookshelves. "For your teaching materials," he explained. "The ranch children need education too. I thought perhaps, when you're ready, you might consider tutoring them. There are only 5 school-age children among the Hands families now, but in time there might be more." Tears sprang to Abigail's eyes. That he had thought not only of her comfort, but of her vocation, her purpose beyond being his wife, touched her deeply. "Preston, this is perfect," she whispered, embracing him. "Thank you for understanding what teaching means to me. I want you to be happy here," he said simply, "in every way." And she was. The transition from schoolteacher to rancher's wife brought challenges, certainly learning to manage a household staff, adapting to the rhythms of ranch life, finding her place in the wider community around Prescott. But, with Preston's support and her own determination, Abigail flourished. By summer, she had established a small school in a converted storage building, teaching the ranch children 3 days a week. She planted her garden, filling it with both vegetables and flowers. She learned to ride better, accompanying Preston on his rounds of the ranch whenever possible. And she began to forge friendships with the wives of neighboring ranchers, women who initially viewed the former schoolteacher with skepticism, but soon came to appreciate her intelligence and warmth. In July, exactly 1 year after the auction that had brought them together, Preston surprised Abigail with a special dinner. Manuel outdid himself with a feast of roast beef, fresh vegetables from Abigail's garden, and an elaborate cake for dessert. "What's the occasion?" Abigail asked as they sat on the porch afterward, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "1 year ago today, I outbid Mrs. Henderson for your father's roll-top desk," Preston replied, taking her hand. "The best investment I ever made," she laughed. "I was so angry at first this stranger buying everything I loved. I noticed. Your eyes could have burned holes through me. And now here we are." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined my life could change so completely in 1 year. Are you happy with the change?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. Abigail lifted her face to his. "Happier than I ever thought possible." He kissed her tenderly. "There's something else?" From his pocket, he withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a slender chain. "Open it," he urged as she examined the beautiful piece. Inside was a miniature copy of her parents' wedding portrait on one side and a lock of Preston's hair on the other. "So, you can always carry both your families with you," he explained, "your past and your present." Abigail blinked back tears as Preston fastened the chain around her neck. "It's beautiful. Thank you. I want you to have everything your heart desires," he said, drawing her close. "You brought such unexpected joy into my life, Abigail. Every day I wake up grateful that I decided to repay that old debt." "As am I," she replied, settling into his embrace as the first stars appeared above the mountains. "As am I." The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Harringtons. The ranch prospered under Preston's careful management, expanding as they purchased adjacent properties. Abigail's small school grew as more hands with families joined the operation, eventually requiring the construction of a proper schoolhouse and the hiring of a second teacher to assist her. They continued to visit Eagar several times a year, maintaining Abigail's childhood home and their connections to the community there. On these visits, they often laughed about how their story had become local legend, embellished with each telling until Preston was practically depicted as a knight in shining armor, rescuing a damsel in distress. "If they only knew how you snore," Abigail would tease. "Or how you burn toast," he would counter, kissing away her mock indignation. In their 3rd year of marriage, Abigail gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter, Elizabeth, joined the family. As their children grew, so did their sense of being exactly where they were meant to be, their lives intertwined in ways neither could have predicted that hot July day at an auction in Eagar. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston arranged a special surprise. When Abigail entered the dining room that evening, she found not only a beautifully set table, but an unexpected guest, Sheriff Wilson, now retired and rarely traveling beyond Eagar. "Sheriff!" she exclaimed, embracing the older man. "What a wonderful surprise." "Couldn't miss your anniversary, Mrs. Harrington," he replied gruffly, though his eyes twinkled. "Besides, your husband made me an offer I couldn't refuse." "Oh?" She turned to Preston questioningly. "I asked the sheriff to bring something special from Eagar," Preston explained, gesturing to a large object in the corner, covered with a sheet. At his nod, Sheriff Wilson pulled away the sheet to reveal her father's roll-top desk, polished to a high shine and fitted with a new chair. "But how?" Abigail gasped. "We left it in the Eagar house. I arranged to have it transported here secretly last month," Preston said, "for your study. I thought it was time it came home to you permanently." Abigail ran her fingers over the smooth oak surface, memories flooding back. Her father, working late into the night. Herself, as a little girl, sitting on his lap as he showed her his medical journals. The day of the auction when she thought she'd lost it forever. "This is where it all began," she said softly, "with this desk." "A small price for the happiness I've found," Preston replied, slipping his arm around her waist. Sheriff Wilson cleared his throat. "Your husband asked me to give you this too," he said, handing Abigail an envelope. Inside was a yellowed page torn from a Bible, with handwriting she recognized immediately as her father's. It was a list of patients from his war service, with brief notes about their treatments. Halfway down the page, she found the entry. P. Harrington, 19, Virginia. GSW left thigh. Attempted amputation averted. strong constitution, excellent recovery prospects. Gave name of Eagar, Arizona Territory for future correspondence. Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she realized she was holding the very document that had set their story in motion, her father's note that had brought Preston to Eagar 20 years later. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "In an old field hospital record book at the War Department in Washington," Preston explained. "I wrote to them years ago, asking if they had any records of your father's service. This arrived last month." She embraced him, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you. For everything." That night, after the sheriff had retired to the guest room and the children were asleep, Abigail and Preston sat on their porch as they had countless evenings before, looking out over the ranch that had become their shared legacy. 10 years? Preston mused, his fingers interlaced with hers. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode into Eagar looking for Dr. Drake." "And sometimes it feels like we've always been together," Abigail replied, "as if my life before you was just preparation for this." He brought her hand to his lips. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving your teaching career, your independence?" She shook her head firmly. "Never. I still teach. I still have independence. But now I also have you, our children, this life we've built together." She smiled up at him in the moonlight. "Remember what you underlined in that Tennyson book you gave me? 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." I think about that sometimes, how close we came to never meeting. If your father hadn't saved my leg, if you hadn't kept that Bible with his name, if I hadn't arrived on the very day of the auction, the possibilities hung in the air between them, paths not taken, lives not lived. "I'm glad it happened exactly as it did," Preston said finally. "Even the auction. Especially the auction. Even though it cost you a small fortune," she teased. "Best money I ever spent," he replied without hesitation. "It bought me everything that matters." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge above their land, Abigail thought about the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment. From the despair of that auction day to the joy of their life together, children sleeping peacefully inside, a thriving ranch surrounding them, and decades of shared future stretching before them. Preston had given her back her possessions all those years ago, but in doing so, he had given her something far more valuable, a love that had only deepened with time, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, and the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "I love you, Preston Harrington," she said simply. "And I love you, Abigail Harrington," he replied, drawing her close. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days to come." In the soft glow of the porch lantern, their silhouettes merged into one as they shared a kiss that held both the memory of their beginning and the promise of their future, a future neither could have imagined that day in Eagar, when a desperate young woman watched a stranger buy everything she owned, not knowing he would soon give back not only her possessions, but her hope, her joy, and ultimately, her heart.